Developing video games is hard. It's a work of extraordinary passion and dedication to accomplish what can often feel impossible to make your creative dream a reality. And that's just indie development. AAA game development is an entirely different beast that takes years and hundreds of people all with the same dedication and passion to turn that impossible idea into a reality. Enter Donald Mustard and GlyphX. GlyphX was a company that specialized in doing art for video games promotional material, doing things such as box art and illustrations for magazines. Donald, however, had bigger ideas. He had a sci-fi epic he wanted to create. If there's one thing to give Mustard credit for, it's that he didn't do half measures. Despite the company having no formal game development experience, he was able to secure the writing talents of Orson Scott Card, before he went off the deep end, to do the game's dialogue, and Tommy Tallarico, a prolific composer at the time and now a board member of the struggling Intellivision Amico, to do the game's music. But Mustard didn't want to stop there. He wanted tie-in comics, smaller side games, novels. He wanted to saturate the market with so much Advent lore you, quote, wouldn't know what it started as. However, after being repeatedly turned down by publishers, he finally got a bite from Majesco, who gave him enough staffing to have a roughly 15-person team to try and create the AAA sci-fi epic of his dreams. Advent Rising would release to much fanfare in 2005, getting trailers in movie theaters, a massive marketing push, and an in-game race to collect all the secrets first for $1 million in cash. Could Mustard pull off the impossible and live up to the hype with his small ragtag team with no development experience? Most of you already know, but let's find out. To give you an idea of how poorly things went for the Advent franchise, the tie-in books never happened. The planned spin-off game, a PSP action game called Advent Shadow, was cancelled shortly after the release of Advent Rising. The $1 million contest flatly advertised on the box for the game was cancelled after a few months because the marketing teams at Majesco realized they had no way to figure out who was cheating and who wasn't. So, instead they offered up free games to everyone who could verify they bought the game. They actually had to provide a receipt of purchase months later, and participated in the contest. These free games weren't bad offerings. They included such hits of the day as Phantom Dust, Guilty Gear X2, and Psychonauts. But all this says nothing about the game itself. Now, while Xbox wasn't the lead development platform, PC was. The Xbox version came out several months before the PC one, and is the version most players at the time experienced. Well, it was a bit of a technical mess that seemed barely held together by scotch tape and gum. The PC release fixed some of the bugginess and ran a little bit better, but by then, the damage was already done. I didn't get a chance to play the PC version of the game for this video, but I did play through the game fully on both an original Xbox and a Series X running the game in backwards compatible mode, which sharpens up the game significantly and fixes many of the game's frame rate issues. Advent Rising was built on the Unreal 2 engine, a common engine of the era, but the development team still seemed to struggle with it. They wanted to make a game of big open-world environments with huge combat arenas and detailed graphics, and this was certainly something they attempted to deliver. The game does sport large environments, and those are frequently filled with large combat arenas. However, the graphics themselves vary wildly from blobby messes to well-realized comic-inspired characters and vistas. It's just an extremely inconsistent execution. These design choices, while bold, were too much for the team to figure out how to optimize to the original Xbox. And despite help from an external studio to get the game running on the hardware, it's an absolute slideshow of an experience, with the frame rate constantly lurching into single digits during combat sequences. As the game wears on, you start to get an idea of where these issues are going to arise and plan your combat strategy around that, but more on that later. Then there's the bugs. I've had the game lock up on me. I've watched enemies disappear. I've seen the audio cut out. There's severe clipping issues in the game, and there's even a cutscene where the audio is just several seconds out of sync.
Oh, I see. Then why are they practically extinct?
This debate is pointless.
My favorite glitch is that when you beat the game and the final cutscene plays, it cuts back to the final level for half a second. then loads the main menu. Speaking of cutscenes, Advent Rising is filled to the brim with them, and I don't think it's out of an idea of creating a cinematic masterpiece. Advent's cutscenes are, without fail, every single one of them trying to mask a load time. A few of these are rendered to look like CGI cutscenes that were clearly handled by a third party. And while these are largely fine, they are the exception, not the rule. The majority of cutscenes are simply pre-rendered movies that feature the in-game graphics, but very little regard has been paid to them. Camera movement is sloppy at best. Bugs, glitchy AI, and wonky physics are all fully present in these pre-rendered movies. Things like characters' clothes clipping through their bodies and enemies in combat glitching and standing on one another. When you take the time to create a pre-rendered cutscene to hide a load time, you have to go in and make sure that what's presented to the viewer is flawless. And this level of sloppiness is simply unacceptable. Half of these cutscenes serve almost nothing to the game's overall narrative. While some have dialogue and move the story along, many simply show the environment you're loading into or attempts an epic camera pan through random people in combat for a few seconds while the game loads. None of it works, and it really pulls you out of what little momentum the game can build. Advent struggles to build any momentum as the game starts for one simple reason: ideas. This is a game that has so many ideas they want it to build in, but had neither the time, budget, or talent to implement them properly. As the game begins, you're immediately tossed into technical issues and dialogue that, despite best efforts from most of the voice actors, reads like a first draft from Card.
I hope you're thirsty.
Why?
Because you're dumb and ugly. But I can do something about thirsty.
It's full of cringy dialogue that I suspect sounded just as bad in 2005 as it does today. Nobody talks even remotely like a real person, and the characters are all extremely unlikable people. You are Gideon Wythe, a young hotshot space pilot who can stand with one foot on either side of the Grand Canyon. You're here with your equally hotshot war hero brother and your fiancée, whose entire personality consists of kicking soldiers in the dick. Anyhow, you're here to have first contact with aliens. It turns out these generic-as-hell aliens worship humans as a long-lost deity race, and are trying to warn you of another, even more generic-as-hell alien race known as the Seekers, who are about to show up to xenocide you. None of the build-up is done well, and then you're tossed into the half-baked first half of the game. Advent largely plays as a third-person shooter with a targeting system where you flick the thumbstick towards an enemy you want to target. Like much of the game, it's a cool idea with poor execution that works correctly far less often than it needs to. The actual gunplay is awkward, unfun, and again, half-baked. And that's partially due to the systems the game is hiding from you until later, and partially because the game has a light RPG mechanic in it. As you use your weapons and abilities, you become more proficient with them. So while at the start of the game every single enemy is a bullet sponge and guns don't feel particularly fun to handle, by the end, the guns you choose to use now have alternative fire modes, precision locking, and additional stopping power that can make you feel overpowered at times. Early on in the game, you're told to make a choice of saving your brother or fiancé, and the game feigns major changes depending on what you do. Your choice doesn't matter at all. A couple of cutscenes change lightly, as well as the appearance of the final boss, but
I tire of this.
whoever survives dies unceremoniously anyway. If you can trudge your way through the uninspiring first half of the game, the ideas all finally start to come together in the second. At this point, the plot informs us that you've got latent psychic powers, and about every 20 minutes from here till the end of the game, you'll unlock something new. This is where the gunplay starts to get fun. Diving through the air activates a bullet time-like ability that allows you to aim for weak points. The psychic powers range from lifting objects, to putting up defensive shields, to shooting fire and ice out of your hands. These can be leveled up too, and combine with each other and the guns to allow for creative and exciting combat. By the time you reach the end, you'll feel so powerful you'll feel like a demigod, and the game knows it.
Well, you're not the only demigod on this flight.
Unfortunately, this is also where the game introduces several boss fights which range from frustratingly stupid in its design, to a final boss fight that's one of the easiest final bosses I've ever experienced. It ends on a pretty weak cliffhanger.
Master Chief, you mind telling me what you're doing on that ship?
Sir, finishing this fight.
Oops, sorry.
Come with me, human. There is much to be done.
And we'll never see if this story had any potential to actually recover from the writing, storytelling, and technical mess this first and only game from GlyphX was. It's frustrating because you can see a good game hidden in here. A better and more experienced team truly could have made something special here. Instead, what we got was a mess of half-finished systems and incomplete and rough ideas thrown together in a blender and hoped it worked out. One area that did manage to come through this unscathed was the soundtrack. While the playback in the game is buggy and often cuts out or triggers late for no good reason, Tommy Talrico delivers an absolutely killer score. The game's opening title's Muse has been covered by the London Philharmonic. And other tracks in the game hit the sci-fi epic highs you're looking for. This game failed so spectacularly it drove Majesco into a slow death spiral. GlyphX Games folded and was purchased by a group called Sandman Studios, who to this day on their website have this to say about Advent Rising. We are very proud of the work on this game and present it as a showcase of our gaming ability. Oof. Finally, we have Donald Mustard himself. He went on to form Chair Entertainment, which produced a number of highly popular, small, extremely focused games such as Undertow and Shadow Complex on the 360, and the Infinity Blade games on iPhone. Donald learned his lessons from Advent Rising, and today he finds himself as a high-ranking part of the Fortnite machine. Advent is not a hard game to find if you feel compelled to play it. It sells for $10, and even that can feel like too much. Advent has great ideas, but it never really rose to the challenge it created for itself and simply imploded under the pressure. Today, it's remembered for a little more than the botched $1 million contest. While it doesn't appear to be on the cards, I would love to see what a competent team could do with these ideas, and what a proper version of Advent could look like today.